What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back to 5 Questions with Levi, the Return, episode 12? Yes, we are back for the 12th episode of the weekly Q&A show, and more questions got asked, and a reminder to those of you who are watching that want to ask me a question for a future episode, send them in the comments section below, and I will do my best to answer them in the next video. But without further ado, let's get to some questions. Question number 1 comes from Dimebag Daryl, who asks, why do I hate Cleveland? Oh. Where do I begin with why I hate Cleveland, Ohio so much? Well, for one thing, don't care for the Browns. I've always been a Bengals fan because Cincinnati's closer than Cleveland. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that's there is a terrible Hall of Fame that disrespects many bands. Don't care for the Cleveland Indians. Not that great of a baseball team, to me at least. And fuck LeBron James. That's pretty much the short, sweet, to the point answer I got for why I hate Cleveland, Ohio. So, yeah. Here comes the hate. I can already tell. Question number 2 comes from Space Mel Ferrari 248, who asks, what do I think about Danny Phantom? I fucking love Danny Phantom. Man, it's like, have you at Blaze Life not been paying attention to my answers in previous questions about Nickelodeon shows? Basically, any Nickelodeon show, for the most part, from like 2009 on back to about 1996 or so, I can tell you my opinion on it, but yeah, Danny Phantom was one of my favorites, cartoon-wise, on Nickelodeon. I like how it was done by the same guy who did Fairly Odd Parents, that Butch Hartman, I believe was his name, who did both of those shows for a while. And yeah, I really liked how the action was on that show. And I know there was a lot of people who had theory crafted that Timmy Turner grew up to be 13 and became Danny Phantom, which was proven not to be true. But could you have imagined if that theory actually came true? That'd be kind of weird now that I think about it. But yeah, what do I think about Danny Phantom? Great cartoon. I would go back and watch it again whenever I can. So thank you for that one. Question number 3 comes from Mr. Death Metal, good old buddy, asking me, do I listen to Trivium? Of course I do. I mean, I haven't listened to much of the new stuff, like the last 2 albums, even though I hear their last 2 albums were incredible returns to form for the band after some missteps with albums like In Waves, Vengeance Falls, and Silence in the Snow. But I've always been a big fan of Trivium. Matt Heafy, an underrated guitarist and singer. Like, he's so talented. And he's only in his mid-30s, and he's been going since the early 2000s, when he was just in middle school, high school, you know? And as far as, like, any albums I have their 3 best albums, Ascendancy, Crusade, and Shogun. I do want to, at some point, get Ember to Inferno, their debut, because I think that's their 4th best, at least from what I've listened to. Haven't listened to all of Sin and the Sentence, and I haven't listened to all of What the Dead Man Say, but I heard a lot of people really, really liked What the Dead Men Say. Even Cover Killer Nation had, at one point, on a YouTube stream last year, in his top 15 of best albums of 2020, so it should go to show you how far Trivium have come to kind of bounce back after a few missteps in the early 2010s. So yeah, Trivium's always been a favorite band of mine. Not in the top 10, maybe top 15, top 20, but yeah, amazing band. Deserves more respect, and by the way, they are not metalcore. If you have guitar solos more than 50% of your album, you're not metalcore anymore. Ugh. I keep having to hammer that point in just to tell people the truth. Question number 4 comes from Daily988. What is my music guilty pleasure? I don't really have any that people would think is completely off the wall. Like, I'll listen to, like, a Lady Gaga song, particularly the song Bad Romance. I'll listen to it here and there if I'm in the mood. I like listening to Melissa Lamb on Twitch, who does like piano pop music. She's pretty cool. Yeah, I really don't have any real guilty pleasure that people would think is completely off the wall insane on my part. So, I mean, it's really what you get with that one. And finally, question 5 from James Qualls, Red Racer 1985, who asks, in my opinion, what's the most underrated era of thrash metal? Wow, because thrash had been around since pretty much when the 80s began. Like, thrash had been around since 1980 when you had... 1980, 1981 when you had bands like Exodus, Overkill, Metallica, Anthrax, Slayer starting up around that time. Creator and Sodom over in Germany starting up around that same time. So thrash had been going around since the beginning of the 80s. And in the 80s, it was the best era of thrash, the entire decade. The 80s thrash sound was the best thing in metal that whole decade. I'm just going to say it right now. Even though, yeah, early black metal was great, early death metal was great, early sounds of prog, New Album was going strong by the beginning of the decade, the early glam stuff was great as well. But thrash, forget about it. It was just the best time. But as far as, like, underrated era, I'm going to say the 90s, because when you think about, when you go back in metal history, it's like, the glam bands got killed off thanks to the grunge movement that started in the early 90s, or begun in the mainstream in the early 90s, even though grunge had been around since the mid-80s. Thrash kind of got a bit of a setback from that. So, a lot of thrash bands during the 90s were experimenting, like, in the beginning of the decade, Metallica went traditional heavy metal and then went hard rock traditional metal by the end of the decade. Same thing goes for Megadeth, even though they started 1990 off with one of the best thrash albums of all time with Rust in Peace. Slayer kind of stuck the course most of the decade until the end when Diabolus and Musica came out and they tried to go Limp Bizkit and that was terrible. Overkill basically stuck it out throughout the 90s, but then you have bands like Exodus experimenting with a Pantera-esque sound, and it didn't work for them, and it led to them breaking up for a while until the early 2000s. Testament went through starting out thrash, then became traditional metal, then groove metal, then death thrash. They were kind of just all over the place with every album they put out in the 90s. Creator, after they put out Coma of Souls 1990, they went through industrial and gothic metal, and it did not work for me at all. Anthrax started out with Persistence of Time. That was a great thrash album, and then they became more of an alternative groove metal band when they changed singers. Give me a second. Sepultura started the decade off with Arise, which is one of the best thrash albums ever. Then they became groove/nu metal throughout the rest of the decade, and some people liked it, others not so much. And then like a band like Sodom kept the thrash sound going throughout the 90s. It's just they experimented with the thrash sound a little bit. Like they started out with the album Better Off Dead, which was more of a traditional thrash metal album. Then Tapping the Vein, which was more death thrash. And then they went through 3 straight albums with Get What You Deserve through Till Death Do Us Unite, where they went through trying to combine other elements. Like with Get What You Deserve, it combined like speed metal influences, a Motorhead with a little bit of punk. Masquerade and Blood, it was a little bit of punk with a little groove and death metal. And then Till Death Do Us Unite was more punk thrash. And then they ended the decade with Code Red, which was a traditional thrash album. But outside of those big ones, there were still other great thrash bands coming out of the underground in the 90s, like Demolition Hammer, first 2 albums in the 90s, thrasher pieces. The Haunted by the end of the decade was going strong. The Crown at the end of the decade was incredible. There were still plenty of great thrash metal bands during the 90s, it's just they didn't get known for it too much, and as well, death metal, black metal, and grindcore had become bigger and more extreme, and it kind of made thrash sound a bit tame by that point. But once we get to the 2000s, thrash is back in full swing with the old guard going back to their roots and new bands coming up, and the thrash revival still going strong. to this very day. But yeah, the 90s, I consider a very underrated time for thrash bands. But anyways, that does it for this week's episode of 5 Questions with Levi. Be sure to send me a question in the comments section below, and I will answer it next week for episode 13! But until then, horns high, and I will see you soon. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Hey, can you fix this for me, please? I sure can. Okay, let's see what we got to drink. Ah, fucking perfect. Ah, some good old Powerade. Delicious. No, not really. You know what I like to have every morning? A nice sandwich with some Clover Valley creamy peanut butter. But you know what else I want to do with this? I want to dip my balls in it! Let's see what we got in here. Damn it, we don't even have Spam in here! Whoa!